Have you ever wondered what it was really like to live back in ancient Rome? Yeah, forget the big name emperors and the gladiators for just a second. We're about to dive into the invisible pyramid that basically decided your entire life. We're talking everything from who you could marry to whether you were even considered a person at all.
So, that brings us to the big question. Who really held the power in ancient Rome? Now, it seems like a simple question, right? But the answer is surprisingly complicated. It's all about your family, your wealth, and a super rigid system of control. Let's unpack that right now.
Okay, first things first, what do we even mean when we say social structure? Well, just think of it like the layers in a cake, or a society, where people are organized based on power, wealth, and status. But here's the kicker for Rome. For most folks, the layer you were born into, that was pretty much where you stayed, for your whole life.
The Romans basically built their entire society like a giant pyramid. You've got a tiny, super powerful group of elites right at the very top. And who's holding that whole thing up from the bottom? Yep, pretty much everybody else. Now, this structure gave them incredible stability, don't get me wrong, but it was all built on a foundation of deep, deep inequality that was almost impossible to escape.
So, let's start where all the power was concentrated, shall we? We're going to head right to the absolute tip of that pyramid and meet the powerful patrician elite.
So, who were these patricians, anyway? Well, they weren't just rich. They were part of these ancient noble families. Their power wasn't something they earned. No, it was inherited. They controlled most of the land, which was the source of all the real wealth back then. And because of that, they just completely dominated politics and the Roman Senate.
Okay, so from that tiny little peak, let's travel all the way down to the huge, sprawling base of this pyramid. This is where we find the plebeian majority.
And the difference between the two is, well, it's just massive. The patricians were the landowners, the senators, the leaders, all born into these giant estates. And the plebeians, they were everybody else, the farmers, the laborers, the soldiers, the people who actually made the empire run. But here's the thing, they started out with hardly any rights and had to fight for literally centuries just to get a say in anything.
And this brings us to a really critical question. If the huge majority of Romans were plebeians, why in the world didn't they have the most power? I mean, why didn't they just take over? The answer is pretty fascinating, and it lies in the invisible structures that held this whole pyramid together.
The reason the majority didn't rule is all about what you could call the social glue that held Roman society together. To really get it, we've got to look at three key things: family, patrons, and the hidden rules of power.
All right, the first piece of that glue was the family itself, which was ruled by a figure called the pater familias, the father of the family. And look, this wasn't just a term of respect, like, oh, he's the head of the household. No. He held absolute legal power over every single person in his household, even his adult children. This system basically taught every Roman from birth that authority was top-down and absolute, which made the whole social pyramid feel completely natural.
So under the pater familias, everyone knew their place. Women couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office, their world was the household. Now, some elite women, for sure, had a ton of influence behind the scenes through their powerful families, but their public lives were very restricted. And children, they were expected to give total obedience, and their whole future, their education, who they'd marry, was all decided for them based on family wealth and, of course, their gender.
Now, this idea of dependency spread out from the home and into public life through a system called patronage. Here's how it worked. A wealthy patrician, the patron, would support lower-class plebeians, his clients, with maybe some money or legal help. And in return, those clients owed him their public support and their political loyalty. It created this huge, complex web of obligations that connected everyone, all while making sure the elite stayed firmly in control.
But now, we have to go even further down, all the way to the very foundation that this entire pyramid was built on. Let's take a look at the brutal reality of slavery and the nearly impossible chance of ever climbing that social ladder.
So, at the absolute bottom were the enslaved people. And let's be really clear here, they weren't considered people, they were property. They had zero rights and were forced to do the most grueling, backbreaking labor that the empire was literally built on. Now, a tiny step above them were the freedmen. These were people who had been enslaved but had somehow managed to gain their freedom. Their rights were still very limited, but they could work, they could earn money, and that offered just the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, their children could have a better life.
So when you look at this incredibly rigid structure, just think about it for a second. Which group do you think had the absolute hardest time moving up? And maybe more importantly, why was the system designed to be so incredibly difficult to escape in the first place?
The hard truth is, for almost everyone in ancient Rome, social mobility was basically a fantasy. The system just wasn't designed for opportunity. It was designed for stability, for order. At the end of the day, the single most important thing that determined your life was who you were born to, period.
Okay, so let's pull all these different threads together and really look at the big picture. You can think of this entire social structure as one massive societal bargain, what we can call the price of order.
So what was this trade-off, this Roman bargain? Well, on the one hand, Rome got incredible stability. It was a highly organized society where everybody knew their place, and that provided the kind of order you needed to run a huge empire. But the cost? Oh, the cost was immense. A staggering gap between the rich and poor, almost zero personal freedom or opportunity, and a system that relied on the brutal institution of slavery.
And all of this leaves us with a pretty timeless question, one that goes way beyond ancient Rome. That rigid pyramid gave Rome stability for centuries, no doubt, but it forces us to ask, when does a stable society become a stagnant one? That's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.